Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The land around Silver Creek, Arizona, 1884, stretched in every direction like an ocean of dried dust and yellow grass. Nothing moved except the wind scraping across old fence posts and the occasional raven passing overhead. A small cabin sat alone in that emptiness, its wood gray from years of sun, its roof patched with whatever could be found: tin sheets, deer hide, a strip of bark. Smoke rose weakly from the chimney, breaking the stillness. Inside lived Naira, a woman who no longer belonged anywhere. She was Apache by birth, but had not seen her tribe since the army drove them north. Her husband, once a scout for the same army, had died under circumstances nobody ever explained properly. They told her it was an accident, wrong orders, mistaken fire, but no one looked her in the eyes when they said it. Since then, she had lived here, apart from everyone, making a living from what the land could still offer: dried herbs, stitched hides, small trades at the edge of town. The cabin smelled of smoke, leather, and boiled sage. On the wall hung her husband's old knife, its handle cracked. She still touched it sometimes before sleeping, not out of ritual, but habit. Each morning she started her day the same way: sweeping sand from the floor, feeding her horse, and checking traps near the creek. The silence comforted her more than human voices ever had. But that morning, the wind had changed direction, and a faint darkness in the distance warned of a dust storm rolling fast from the south. Naira's movements became quick, precise. She tied down the shutters, brought the horse inside the small shed, and covered the herbs hanging outside. The storm came faster than she expected. The sky turned a deep brown, swallowing the hills in minutes. She felt the familiar pulse of anxiety, that tightness in the chest she always got when the land reminded her how small she really was. She closed the cabin door, dropped the latch, and lit her only lantern. The flickering light cut through the dust, sneaking in through the cracks. Then came the sound, faint at first, then clear, hoofbeats approaching from the ridge. She froze. Few people rode this far out. Her first thought was trouble: drifters, soldiers, or someone from town thinking they could take what she had. She reached for her rifle, the one her husband left her, and stood by the window. The wind carried a blurred shape forward, a man on horseback, bent low, struggling against the storm. His horse limped badly. He didn't look like a soldier. No uniform, no badge, just a wide-brimmed hat and a dust-covered coat. He stopped a few yards from the door and raised one hand to his forehead, trying to see through the blowing sand. Then he dismounted, leaning heavily on the saddle for balance. The way he moved, tired, cautious, told her he wasn't here for violence. Still, she didn't open the door. "Ma'am," his voice came rough through the wind. "Just need a place to wait it out." Naira hesitated. Every instinct said, keep the door shut. Strangers brought stories, and stories brought pain. But the storm howled so fiercely now that even she could feel its grit biting her skin through the gaps in the walls. Leaving him outside would mean his horse wouldn't last an hour. She thought of her husband, how he used to stop for strangers, saying the desert had its own code. She opened the door halfway, keeping the rifle low but ready. The man stepped closer, his face lined with exhaustion and streaked with dust. "My name's Elias Ward," he said, voice steady but weak. "I'll pay you for shelter, just till it passes." Naira studied him in silence. His clothes were worn, boots caked in mud from long travel. The way he stood, straight-backed despite the storm, reminded her of soldiers, though something about his eyes didn't fit. They carried a heaviness that didn't belong to a man on duty anymore. Finally, she moved aside and nodded toward the fire. "Don't touch anything," she said quietly. He nodded once and stepped in, removing his hat. As he shut the door, the storm roared louder, covering the world outside in a thick, angry sound. Inside, the cabin filled with the tense quiet of two people used to being alone. Elias crouched near the fire, holding his hands over the flames. His fingers trembled slightly. Naira stayed near the wall, rifle still close, watching him without speaking. After a long while, she asked, "You came from town?" Silver Creek, he said, was heading north. Horse went lame before the ridge. Why north? Looking for work. Break horses, fix fences. Whatever pays. She said nothing more. The conversation fell back into silence. Elias glanced around, the herbs drying near the ceiling, the handmade blankets folded with precision, the small clay jars labeled in Apache script. He understood this wasn't just a place to live. It was a woman's way of surviving when the world didn't want her anymore. For a moment, Naira's eyes softened. She could see his fatigue, the kind that came from more than travel. A man running from something he couldn't name. She recognized it because she carried the same kind. When a storm hit full force, the sound against the walls became deafening. The lantern shook on its hook. Dust poured through the cracks like smoke. Naira moved closer to the fire, clutching her shawl. Elias quietly added more wood, careful not to make noise. Neither spoke again that night. But in that storm, with nothing beyond the walls except the sound of wind and sand, something fragile began to take shape. Not trust, not comfort, just the smallest understanding that both were stranded souls who had nowhere else left to go. As dawn approached, the storm weakened. Naira didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, rifle across her lap, listening to the stranger breathe steadily from a corner. She wondered if letting him in was a mistake, or the first human choice she'd made in years. Outside, the first light of morning broke through the thinning dust. Inside, two lives, one bound by grief, the other by guilt, shared the same silence for the first time. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a dull, gray silence. The air smelled of wet dust and ash. Naira opened the door and stepped outside, squinting against the light. The desert looked stripped bare, her fence was half buried, and the trough had filled with sand. Her horse snorted weakly in the shed, unsettled from the night's noise. Elias followed her out, holding his hat in one hand. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, his face pale under the dirt, eyes ringed with exhaustion. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he began quietly clearing the sand away from the door, as though he already belonged there. "You don't have to," Naira said, her tone sharp but not cold. He glanced up. "If I don't work, I start thinking. Work's better." The answer disarmed her. She turned back toward the fence and began checking what was left of it. The poles were cracked, one section fully collapsed. Elias joined her without being asked, picking up the loose boards. The silence between them wasn't heavy this time, just necessary. Through the daylight, Naira finally saw him clearly. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, lean but strong. His coat was torn at the shoulder, his boots worn through at the toes. He had scars across his knuckles and one along his neck that looked old but deep. He worked with focus, not looking for conversation. When the fence stood upright again, he wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked around. "You live out here alone?" Naira nodded. "People don't come this far." "Maybe that's the point," he said quietly. His tone wasn't mocking. It sounded like understanding. She looked at him longer this time, wondering what kind of man spoke that way without asking for anything. Inside the cabin, she brewed coffee, weak, bitter, but hot. She set one cup down near him. "You fought," she said. It wasn't a question. Elias took the cup and held it in both hands. "Union Cavalry. Tennessee Regiment. Too long ago to matter now." "You were a soldier," she said. "Once. Not anymore." He didn't add more, but his eyes did. There was something broken in them, not from fear, but from remembering. Naira understood that look. It was the same one she saw in her own reflection sometimes. After breakfast, he checked his horse. The animal's leg was swollen and bleeding slightly where the shoe had torn away. Elias crouched beside it, pressing gently around the wound. Naira watched from the doorway. She didn't offer to help, but she noted how carefully he touched the animal. Patient, respectful, almost apologetic. "You'll need to rest him," she said. "At least 2 days." Elias nodded. "Then I'll move on. You have somewhere to go?" He paused. "Not exactly. Just away." That answer lingered. Away. From what? She didn't ask, but she already knew, the kind of past men didn't speak about because there were no words left for it. The day stretched long. Naira worked on drying herbs and stitching a hide. Elias cleaned his saddle and patched a hole in the roof. It was the kind of quiet that carried no tension, only survival. Each kept to their side of the cabin, but something about his presence steadied the place. As the sun began to lower, the wind shifted again, calmer now, carrying the faint scent of pine from the north. Elias stood by the window, looking out over the land. "You've been here long?" "5 winters," she replied. "That's a long time to be alone." "I was with people once," she said softly. "They left, or were taken." Her voice didn't shake, but there was a weight in it that made him look at her differently. He didn't ask how or why. He simply nodded, accepting the truth as it was. Later, while she prepared stew, he helped cut wood for the fire. His movements were quiet, deliberate. When their hands brushed as she handed him a knife, neither spoke, but both felt something. Not attraction yet, but awareness. Two people who'd been ghosts for years, noticing the other existed. When night fell, they sat across from each other, the fire between them. Elias ate slowly, staring at the flames. "You ever go into town?" he asked. "Only when I need to," she said. "They don't want me there." He raised his head. "Because you're Apache?" "Because I remind them of what they did." Elias looked away, jaw tightening. "I know that feeling." She studied him closely. "What did you do?" He took a long breath. "Followed orders. Too many." That answer told her more than a confession ever could. She understood that kind of burden, the kind you can't pray away, can't forget even when sleep finally comes. The fire crackled. Outside, coyotes cried from the hills. The sound drifted in through the cracks, sharp and lonely. Elias leaned back against the wall, exhausted but calm. "You should sleep," Naira said. He nodded but didn't lie down immediately. Instead, he asked, "Why'd you let me in last night?" Her hands paused over the firewood. "Because the storm would have killed you." "That's not the only reason," he said quietly. She didn't answer. Truthfully, she didn't know. Maybe because his voice didn't sound like the others who came before. Men who spoke loud, took what they wanted, left nothing but fear behind. Elias Ward spoke like a man already tired of taking. When she finally lay down on her cot, she kept her rifle near, as always. But for the first time in years, the silence of the cabin didn't feel so heavy. The stranger's breathing from across the room filled the space that used to echo with absence. As sleep took her, she thought of how strange it felt to share air with another soul again. Not out of trust, not yet, but out of the simple, human need not to vanish completely from the world. By dawn, the wind was gone. Only the faint smell of smoke and coffee lingered. Elias was already outside, repairing the trough before she woke. Watching him through the window, Naira realized something that unsettled her. She didn't want him to leave yet. And that realization frightened her more than any storm ever could. By the third day, the land around Silver Creek had returned to its ordinary stillness, bright, dry, and unforgiving. The storm had left streaks of red clay across the hills, and the air carried a faint metallic smell from the wet earth. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of two solitary lives began to align without either of them speaking about it. Elias repaired the corral, Naira gathered herbs, and when the wind picked up, they closed the shutters in unspoken coordination, as if they had lived under the same roof for years. Elias' horse, still limping, became the quiet excuse for his stay. Naira didn't ask when he planned to leave, and he didn't mention it again. Each morning, he checked the animal's leg with careful patience, and she noticed how gently he spoke to it. Words so low they seemed meant for himself. That gentleness stood out. Men she'd known before spoke in orders and noise. This one carried silence like armor. When Elias wasn't working outside, he helped mend the cabin. He replaced the broken window latch, fixed a leaking section of the roof, and cut new wood for the fire. Naira tried to offer payment in herbs or hides, but he refused with a simple, "You're giving me a roof." "That's enough." She watched him work, realizing how rarely she saw someone move with purpose that wasn't born of greed or fear. Every gesture felt measured, not proud, not humble, just deliberate. Still, she could tell he carried something beneath that calm. When he looked toward the ridge at dusk, his expression hardened for just a moment, as if the horizon reminded him of a life he was still trying to outrun. Naira, too, was not without ghosts. Her husband's death still hung in the quiet corners of her mind. The army said he was killed during a skirmish near Fort McDowell, but she had never been shown his body. Only his knife and uniform returned in silence. Some nights, she still wondered if he had died loyal to the uniform or to his people. The thought never brought peace, only questions that no one dared to answer. That afternoon, while Elias split wood, she asked the question that had been pressing in her chest since the night he arrived. "You said you fought in the war. How long ago was that?" He paused mid-swing, the axe held still above the log. 18 years. "Why did you stop?" "I didn't stop," he said after a pause. "The war did." It was the kind of answer that said everything without explaining a thing. She studied his face, looking for something beyond the words. His hands were rough, scarred from rope burns and blade work, yet steady. That steadiness made her uneasy. She wanted to know what kind of man he was before the war, what kind of man survives it. Later that evening, Naira boiled coffee while Elias brushed down his horse. She poured 2 tin cups and stepped outside, handing one to him. The gesture was small, but felt like a crossing of lines. "You worked with horses long?" she asked. "Since before I could shoot straight," he said, managing a faint smile. "Back in Missouri. My father ran a breeding ranch till the war took everything." "What happened after?" He took a slow sip of coffee. "I drifted. Took work where I could. Army contracts. Ranch hands. Then I stopped keeping track." Naira nodded, understanding that kind of drifting. The kind that starts as movement but ends as a way of hiding. They stood in silence for a while, watching the fading light spread over the land. The sun dipped low, casting long orange streaks across the dirt. In that hour, everything looked softer, almost forgiving. When they went back inside, Elias sat near the fire, sharpening his knife, and Naira stitched a torn sleeve. The sound of steel against stone filled the room. It wasn't threatening, just steady, rhythmic. She found herself watching his hands, noticing how careful he was even with a blade. "People in Silver Creek," Elias said suddenly, "they talk about a woman living out here. Some say you're a healer. Some say you curse people." Naira's eyes stayed on her stitching. "They talk because they can't understand why I'm still alive. They're afraid of what they can't understand," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised at his tone. He wasn't defending her. He was stating a fact, one he knew too well. "Do they fear you too?" she asked. "They used to," he said. "Maybe they still do. Depends on who remembers." "Why?" Elias hesitated, eyes fixed on a knife in his hands. "Because I rode with men who burned villages. We called it justice back then." The fire popped sharply. The air between them went heavy. Naira didn't move or speak, and Elias didn't look at her. The silence stretched long enough to feel unbearable, but it wasn't hatred that filled it. It was recognition. Both of them carried histories written in violence, not of their choosing. After a long while, she spoke, her voice low. "And now you fix fences." He nodded once. "And now I fix fences." The faintest trace of understanding passed between them. For the first time, Naira didn't see a stranger. She saw another exile, punished not by law but by memory. That night, rain began to fall softly, rare, hesitant drops that darkened the dirt outside. The smell drifted through the cracks in the cabin. Elias added wood to the fire, while Naira sat by the table grinding herbs. The rhythm of their work fell into sync. Two people who said little, yet seemed to move by some quiet, shared understanding. Before turning in, Elias spoke from his cot. "You could leave this place," he said, eyes still on the ceiling. "Find your people again, or start over somewhere else." Naira stared into the fire. "I did leave once," she said, "but grief travels. Doesn't matter where you go, it finds you." Elias turned his head toward her. "You think it ever stops?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but you can stop running from it." The answer lingered in the silence, and for the first time, Elias looked almost at peace. When the fire dimmed, Naira lay awake, watching the faint light dance against the walls. She thought about what he said, about leaving, about what it meant to stay. She realized she no longer felt the urge to push him away. Outside, The rain grew stronger, tapping softly against the roof, a sound that once reminded her of loneliness, but now, somehow, felt like company. By dawn, when the first light filtered through the thin curtains, she found Elias already outside again, feeding the horse, his coat damp with mist. He turned briefly and nodded to her through the open doorway. She nodded back. It wasn't a greeting. It was something quieter, an acknowledgement that neither of them was alone anymore, even if neither dared to say it aloud. The morning after the rain was quiet, almost unreal. The desert outside looked cleaner, its surface washed smooth by the night storm. Puddles shimmered faintly across the clay, and the hills carried a thin mist that softened the harsh lines of the land. Naira stood at the doorway, watching the world regain its color. For the first time in months, the air didn't taste like dust. Elias was already outside, rolling his sleeves up, working on the horse's leg again. He poured water over the wound, binding it with a torn strip of cloth from his coat. His movements were careful, methodical. When he noticed her watching, he gave a faint nod. He's healing. Won't run yet, but he'll stand. She nodded back. Good. Inside, she stirred a pot of cornmeal and beans over the fire. The smell filled the small room. Elias came in, wiping his hands, and she handed him a bowl without words. They sat across from each other at the table, two people who no longer needed to explain their silence. But something in the air between them had shifted since the talk they shared the night before. Elias ate slowly, then glanced at her. You said once you lived with your people before the army came. You never told me what happened. Naira kept her eyes on the fire. They forced us north, she said simply. Most went to San Carlos. My husband stayed behind. They used him as a scout. Said he was helping bring peace. But peace doesn't come from men with guns. Her voice held no anger, only fatigue. Elias listened carefully, not interrupting. He believed if he helped them, maybe fewer of us would die, she continued. But the last time he rode out, they said there was confusion. Shots fired by mistake. No one brought him home. She paused, staring into the flames. They sent me his knife, and a letter written by a man who never met him. Elias looked down at his hands. He'd heard stories like that before, always told by someone on the losing side of orders. He knew what kind of chaos could make a man's death disappear into paperwork. You think he was killed on purpose? He asked quietly. Naira shook her head. I don't know. I stopped asking. The truth doesn't change what's gone. For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, filling the gaps where words would have sounded wrong. Elias leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the small shelf above the bed, on a single pouch of turquoise beads hanging there. Those his? She followed his gaze. Yes, I made them for him the year we married. I never took them off until the night they brought his knife back. Now they just hang there. Feels wrong to wear them without him. He understood that kind of holding on, the weight of things that meant more in memory than they ever did in life. Later, while he fixed the door hinge, she stepped outside with a basin to wash the bowls. The wind had picked up slightly, warm and restless. From the ridge, she could see the faint outline of Silver Creek, small, gray buildings scattered near the riverbed. It had been months since she last went there. The thought of it made her uneasy, but supplies were running low. Inside, Elias spoke from the table, still working on the hinge. You ever think of going back to town? They don't like me there, she said. They don't like me much either, he replied, without looking up. You? He smiled faintly, without humor. I left my regiment in Silver Creek. Men don't forget when someone walks away. Naira looked at him carefully. You deserted? I buried too many boys to keep following orders I didn't believe in, he said. Call it whatever they want. That confession hung in the air for a long time. It explained more than he'd ever said before. The guilt, the distance, the silence. It also shifted something inside her. For the first time, she didn't see a stranger seeking refuge. She saw a man living with punishment he'd already given himself. By late afternoon, the wind turned cooler. Elias gathered firewood, while Naira packed a small sack with dried herbs and animal hides. Tomorrow, I'll ride into town, she said. Trade what I can. You'll need feed for the horse. I'll come with you, Elias offered. She hesitated. You don't owe me that. It's not debt, he said simply. You shouldn't walk into that place alone. Naira studied him, her eyes unreadable, then gave a small nod. All right. That night, they prepared for the trip quietly. Elias checked his revolver, making sure the chamber was clean. Naira laid out a small pouch of herbs for barter and another for medicine. The act of preparing together, wordless, practical, made the cabin feel different, less like a shelter and more like a home shared by two lives bound by circumstance. When the fire dimmed, she sat on the edge of her cot, looking toward the beads above the bed. Her hand rose instinctively, fingers tracing the empty space at her throat where they once hung. Elias watched from across the room, understanding without asking. You still talk to him sometimes? He asked quietly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. When I can't sleep, it's not really talking, just remembering. She hesitated, then added, sometimes I think he hears me. But when I reach for him, she stopped herself, tightening her grip on the blanket. When I'm alone, my hands wander. They look for what's gone. Elias didn't move or speak. The words weren't meant for comfort. They were an admission, raw and unfiltered. He felt something shift inside him. Not desire, but a deep recognition of her grief, of the way absence carves its own kind of scar. He said only, you don't have to apologize for missing someone. She nodded once, her eyes glassy in the firelight. The rest of the night passed in silence. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, and the wind moved softly through the cracks in the cabin walls. Elias lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his own dead, men whose names he couldn't say aloud anymore. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was carrying that weight alone. By dawn, the horizon burned gold. Naira rose before the light, tying her hair back, wrapping a faded shawl around her shoulders. Elias saddled the horse carefully, testing the bandaged leg. It held steady. When they rode out towards Silver Creek, the morning air felt different, lighter, sharper, carrying something between them that neither could yet name. As the cabin disappeared behind them, Naira didn't look back. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was leaving a grave. She was simply moving forward, not toward the past, but toward whatever was left of the living. They reached Silver Creek by mid-morning, the sun already beating hard against the dirt road that cut through the town. The streets were narrow and quiet, lined with wooden storefronts whose signs had faded from years of wind. A few wagons stood near the livery, their wheels half buried in dust. Dogs slept under porches. And yet, even before they stopped, Naira felt the eyes, men leaning against posts, women behind windows, all watching her. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It had been months since she last came here. Nothing had changed, but the air felt heavier now that she wasn't alone. Elias guided his horse beside hers, his hand resting casually near the saddle holster. He didn't look at the people staring. He'd lived long enough to know that looking back only made it worse. Keep close, he said quietly. They stopped at Crawford's trading post, the only place that would still take her herbs and hides. Naira dismounted first, setting her satchel on the porch. Crawford, a tall man with a pale mustache and small eyes, stepped out from behind the counter. His gaze flicked from her face to Elias's, then back again. Well, I'll be damned, he said. Didn't think I'd see you again, widow. Naira's voice was calm. I've got trade, hides, herbs, and salves. Crawford smirked. Folks still buy that stuff. Guess they'll buy anything if it works. He turned his attention to Elias. And you're with her? Elias met his gaze evenly. I'm just helping carry supplies. Sure you are, Crawford said, his tone dripping with suspicion. You watch yourself, soldier. That one's bad luck. Her husband was a scout, you know. Never came back. Some say she knows why. Elias didn't blink. You talk too much for a man doing business. Crawford hesitated. There was something in Elias's tone. Not anger, but authority, the kind that came from a man who'd seen real violence and didn't need to prove it. He stepped back, muttering something about prices, and disappeared inside. While Crawford weighed the goods, Naira kept her eyes on the street outside. A pair of women whispered near the well, casting quick glances at her. A boy pointed before being pulled away by his mother. Nothing had changed. Same fear, same distance. Only now, she wasn't standing in it alone. When Crawford returned, he counted a few coins into her palm. "Don't come back too often," he said flatly. "You make folks uneasy." Elias took a step forward. "She brings you business. You should be thanking her." Crawford shrugged. "Business ain't worth trouble." Naira placed the coins quietly in her pouch and turned to leave. She had learned long ago that arguing with people who already decided who she was only gave them more reason to hate. Outside, Elias followed her toward the horses. "You let him talk like that often?" She adjusted the saddle straps. "Words can't take anything from me." He frowned. "They take more than you think." For a moment, their eyes met. There was no pity in his, only frustration, the kind that came from watching someone bear too much for too long. As they rode through town, the whispers trailed behind them like dust. A drunk man near the saloon shouted, "Hey, soldier, you keeping that Apache for company?" Elias stopped his horse. The man's grin faltered when Elias turned in the saddle, his expression flat, unreadable. "Say that again," Elias said, voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the noise. The man muttered something and stepped back. No one else spoke. Naira looked at Elias quietly. "You didn't need to do that." "Yes, I did," he said. "Some things need to be said out loud." When they left Silver Creek behind, the silence between them was thicker than before. Not from distance, but from unspoken understanding. She knew he'd done what most wouldn't. He knew she didn't want gratitude. They rode until the sound of the town disappeared completely. The open land stretched wide again, free of eyes and judgment. When they stopped near the creek to rest the horses, Elias filled the canteens and handed one to her. "You've lived out here 5 years," he said. "How do you stand it? All that talk, all that blame." She looked at the horizon, eyes narrow against the glare. "You stand it the way you stand grief. You don't argue with it. You just keep breathing until it forgets your name." Elias didn't reply, but something in his face softened. He understood now why she survived when others didn't. She had learned to live without expecting the world to be fair. When they returned to the cabin, the air felt different, heavier, calmer. The ride back had been long, and both were tired. Elias stabled the horse while Naira lit the fire. Neither spoke for a long time. After supper, Elias sat by the door, cleaning his revolver. Naira watched him, her voice quiet when she finally asked, "Why did you really come west, Elias?" He paused, setting the gun aside. "Because there's no one left back east who'd remember me. Out here, I could be someone else. Or nothing at all. And which do you want to be?" He thought for a long time before answering. "Maybe just a man who does no more harm." That simple line cut deeper than any confession. It told her everything she hadn't yet asked, about the war, the guilt, and the reason he stayed. Outside, the moon rose pale over the hills, the light washing through the cracks in the walls. Naira sat across from him, threading the turquoise beads through her fingers. For years, she had kept them untouched, a relic of what she lost. Now, as Elias looked up at her from the firelight, she set them gently on the table between them. "They used to mean belonging," she said. "Now, they just mean waiting. I think I'm done waiting." Elias's gaze lingered on the beads, then on her face. "You don't have to explain it." "I'm not," she said softly. "I'm just telling you I'm still here." The wind outside had quieted, and the fire inside flickered low. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel haunted by what was missing. It felt full of what remained. As they sat there, neither moved closer, neither looked away. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was an understanding, the kind that came not from words, but from two people finally realizing they didn't need to be saved to find peace, only seen. When she rose to bank the fire, Elias spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I'll ride back into town next week. Get you better supplies. Maybe lumber to fix the roof." Naira looked at him, her voice steady. "Then you're staying." He met her gaze. "For a while, maybe." "For a while's enough," she said. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, the quiet turned softer, warmer. For the first time in years, neither of them felt like they were just surviving. 2 days after their return from Silver Creek, the weather changed again. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of silence that comes before the desert decides to test the living. Clouds built over the ridge, thick, gray, and low, and by dusk, thunder rolled deep across the horizon. Elias felt it before it came. He'd spent enough nights on open plains to recognize that kind of warning. He was outside, tightening the roof planks when the wind picked up. Sand whipped into his face, stinging his eyes. "We're getting another one," he called through the door. Naira stepped out, her hair pulled back, a coil of rope in her hands. "I'll bring the horse inside. I'll help." Together they secured the shed, their movements quick, wordless, efficient. The storm broke within minutes. Hard, angry rain slapping against the roof, wind shrieking through the trees. By the time they rushed back inside, both were soaked through. The cabin rattled under the force of it. Elias dropped his hat by the fire, breath heavy. "It's stronger than last time. It'll pass," she said, though her voice carried a trace of unease. The last storm had damaged the roof and nearly flooded the cabin. If this one lasted longer, they might not be so lucky. Water seeped through the crackboards. Elias grabbed a bucket to catch the leaks while Naira piled extra logs on the fire to keep the heat. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the rain drumming on the roof. Elias moved to reinforce the door latch, and Naira watched him. The way he worked without hesitation, calm even as the wind roared around them. She'd lived through years of storms alone, always fighting against fear in silence. But this time it felt different. She wasn't alone in the noise. A sudden crash outside made them both turn. Something heavy had fallen, maybe part of the shed. Naira's hand went instinctively to the rifle on the wall. Elias placed a hand on her arm. "Stay here," he said, already pulling on his coat. "You can't go out in that." He gave a short nod. "If the roof goes, you'll have no shelter." Before she could stop him, he pushed the door open and stepped into the storm. The wind swallowed him instantly, rain hitting hard enough to blur his outline. Naira waited tense, gripping the rifle. Each minute stretched longer than the last. When he finally returned, drenched and shivering, he carried a piece of broken timber under his arm. It was the corral fence. "Came loose. I fixed what I could." She took his coat, hanging it near the fire. "You'll catch cold," she said quietly. He gave a faint grin. Wouldn't be the first time. As he sat by the fire, steam rising off his clothes, Naira knelt beside him with a dry cloth. Without a word, she began wiping the mud from his hands and forearms. He froze and used to the touch. Her hands were steady, her expression focused, practical, not gentle, but real. When she finished, he looked at her, and for the first time, their eyes held longer than a glance. The storm outside thundered, but the space between them felt oddly still. "You could have died going out there," she said. "I've done worse for less," he replied. Her lips tightened, somewhere between frustration and concern. "You don't need to prove anything here." "I wasn't proving anything," he said. "I just don't like watching something fall apart when I can stop it." That answer stayed with her. It was a truth she understood too well, the instinct to fix what's breaking, even when it isn't yours to save. Hours passed. The rain didn't let up. They shared what was left of the coffee, sitting close to the fire to stay warm. The wind howled around the cabin, making it impossible to hear anything but the storm and the faint crackle of flames. Elias leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed, exhaustion pulling at him. Naira watched him in the flickering light. The deep lines on his face, the small scar under his jaw, the way his shoulders stayed tense even in rest. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to relax. "You don't sleep much, do you?" she asked. He opened his eyes. "Not when it rains." "Why?" "Reminds me of Tennessee," he said quietly. "There was a night like this during the war. The ground turned to mud. We buried men in it before sunrise." Naira said nothing. She didn't try to comfort him. She knew better than to touch old wounds that never healed. Instead, she placed another log on the fire and sat beside him. When lightning flashed through the window, she startled slightly. He noticed. "You're not fond of storms either," he said. She shook her head. "Too many nights waiting for men who didn't come back." That simple sentence closed the distance between them more than touch ever could. Another crash came from outside, and the door creaked. Elias rose, but she stopped him with a firm hand on his arm. "Stay," she said. You've done enough." He hesitated, then nodded. The tension between them settled into quiet understanding. The hours dragged until the storm finally began to ease. The rain softened, turning into a slow patter on the roof. The fire burned low, and the cabin filled with the faint hum of calm after chaos. Naira leaned her head against the wall, fatigue catching up to her. "You said you'd leave when the horse was ready," she murmured. "He's ready now." Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You want me gone?" She hesitated. "No, I don't know what to expect when people stay." "I don't either," he said. Their eyes met again. No promises, no declarations, just quiet honesty. The kind that needed no defense. She exhaled slowly, resting her hands on her lap. "Then stay a little longer." He nodded once, his voice low. "I will." When the storm finally died completely, dawn crept across the sky, pale and still. Naira had drifted asleep against the wall. Elias, unable to sleep himself, stood by the door watching the light change. The desert looked new again, washed clean, quiet, forgiving. He turned back toward her face calm for the first time since he'd met her. He thought of leaving that morning, as he once did everywhere else, before anyone could ask him to stay. But as he looked at her, the woman who had faced down loneliness longer than most men faced war, he knew this place had already tied something inside him down. He sat back by the fire, adding one last piece of wood. The faint crackle filled the cabin again. This time, it didn't sound like survival. It sounded like home. The morning after the storm was clear, sharp, and impossibly still. The air carried that strange calm that follows destruction, a silence that almost felt earned. Naira stepped outside barefoot, her dress brushing the wet boards of the porch. The desert glistened in patches, the ground still slick with mud. The creek behind the cabin, normally a thin trickle, now ran fuller than she'd seen in years. Elias was already awake, sitting on the steps with his sleeves rolled, fixing the leather strap of his saddle. His face looked calmer, less guarded. He turned slightly when she stepped out. "Roof held," he said. "We got lucky." "Not luck," she answered. "Work." He smiled faintly. "Work, then." She joined him on the steps, sitting a few inches away. Neither said much after that. The sound of the creek filled the quiet, steady and soft. For the first time since he'd come, she felt no tension in the silence between them. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the quiet that happens when words are no longer needed. By midday, the land began to dry again. Together, they rebuilt the fallen corral, replacing the broken beams with what lumber remained from Elias's repairs. Sweat ran down their faces, and a smell of damp soil lingered in the air. They worked without talking, moving in rhythm, one lifting, one securing. It was the kind of simple work that asked nothing except effort. When the fence stood straight again, Naira leaned against it, catching her breath. "My husband used to say the desert always takes back what you build." Elias set down his hammer. "Then we'll keep building until it gives up trying." That drew a small smile from her, the first true one he'd seen. Later that afternoon, while Elias gathered firewood, Naira went to the small storage chest near her bed. From it she took out a folded blanket, a worn jacket, and a pouch of turquoise beads. She carried them outside, to a patch of ground behind the cabin where the earth was soft from rain. Elias returned just in time to see her kneeling there, digging a shallow hole with her hands. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt. He knew this wasn't something that needed an audience, but she glanced at him once, as if to say it was all right that he saw. "These belonged to him," she said quietly. "I kept them because I thought it meant he was still here somehow. But I think I was just afraid to be the only one left." Elias walked closer, standing beside her. "He's not here, Naira. You are." She placed the jacket and beads into the ground, smoothing the dirt over them with careful hands. Her movements were slow, deliberate, not mourning, not ritual, just release. When she finished, she stayed kneeling, her eyes on the soil. Elias knelt beside her. "What was his name?" "Dakota," she said. "He wanted to be a bridge between worlds." "It broke him." Elias nodded. "Bridges always break first." They stayed there for a long while, the wind moving softly around them. When she finally stood, Something in her posture had changed. The tension that used to live in her shoulders was gone, replaced by a steadiness he hadn't seen before. That evening, she cooked rabbit stew, the smell filling the cabin. They ate by firelight, sitting across from each other as always, but the air between them had shifted again. Not heavy, not uncertain. It felt peaceful. After supper, Elias took out his harmonica, the one he hadn't touched since he arrived. He turned it over in his hands, rubbing away the layer of dust. "You play?" she asked, surprised. "Used to," he said, before everything got too loud. "Play now," she said softly. He hesitated, then lifted it to his lips. The sound that came out was low and rough, the kind of tune that carried miles over empty land. Not cheerful, but not sorrowful either. A song of endurance. Naira sat still, eyes fixed on the fire, letting the notes fill the room. For the first time in years, she didn't feel haunted by silence. When he stopped, she said, "You sound like a man who remembers too much." He set the harmonica down. "You sound like a woman who finally stopped trying to forget." Their eyes met. There was warmth there now, not the kind that burns, but the kind that stays. As the night deepened, Naira stood and moved toward the shelf. She took down a second cup and poured coffee into both. When she handed one to him, their fingers brushed. The touch was small, but held weight. Neither pulled away. "Elias," she said quietly, "if you leave one day, don't leave without saying goodbye." "I won't," he said. "And if you stay?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Then I'll stay because it feels right, not because I owe you anything." "That's all I'd want," she said. Outside, the moonlight cut through the thin curtains, painting silver lines across the wooden floor. Elias leaned back, eyes on the faint glow. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. She considered it. "No, I spent too long thinking about what's gone." He nodded, understanding perfectly. When the fire burned low, Naira stood, walked to the door, and looked out at the desert, the land that had taken so much and yet still offered her another day. For the first time since Takota's death, she didn't feel like she was standing at the edge of something lost. She was standing inside something living. Behind her, Elias said quietly, "You look lighter." She turned slightly, a small smile crossing her face. "Maybe I am." He rose, placing his hat on the hook by the door. A small gesture, but one that said more than any promise could. He was staying, at least for now. That night, as they lay in their separate corners of the same room, the wind outside was calm, carrying only the sound of the creek and the faint crackle of the dying fire. Both were awake for a while, listening to the same silence. Not one born of fear, but of understanding. When sleep finally came, it came without dreams. The ghost had gone quiet, and for the first time in years, the cabin did not feel like a memory. It felt like home. When dawn came, the world outside was quiet, painted in pale gold. A soft breeze carried the scent of wet sage through the open window, and the steady hum of the creek filled the distance. Naira woke slowly, the light catching the faint lines of her face. For a moment, she lay still, listening, not for danger, not for ghosts, but for the sound of life returning. She heard Elias outside, splitting wood. His rhythm was steady and unhurried, the sound of a man who no longer had somewhere else to be. She rose, dressed simply, and stepped out barefoot. The air was cool, brushing against her skin. Elias looked up when she approached. His hat shaded his face, but his eyes were bright in the morning light. "You're up early," he said. "So are you," she replied. "Couldn't sleep." The quiet felt strange. "It always does at first," she said. "Then it starts to feel safe." He nodded, setting the axe aside. The fire from the stove inside sent out a thin trail of smoke through the chimney. Naira went to check the pot she had left simmering overnight: corn, beans, and dried rabbit. The smell filled the cabin, warm and comforting. Elias came in behind her, brushing dust from his hands. "I'll head to town today," he said. "See if Crawford still has the lumber he promised." She paused, then turned to face him. "You don't have to go back there." "I know," he said, "but the roof needs fixing. We can't let the next storm take it down." Something about the way he said we made her chest tighten. It was simple, but it was new. He wasn't a visitor anymore. Then I'll make you a list, she said quietly. As he packed his saddlebag, she placed a few coins in his palm, the same ones from their last trade in town. This is all that's left, she said. Elias closed her hand gently over them. Keep it. I'll trade work for what we need. She hesitated, studying him. They don't owe you kindness. Doesn't matter, he said. I don't need kindness. Just a fair deal. She understood the unspoken part of his answer. He wasn't going there for approval. He was doing what a man does when he's decided to stay. By mid-morning, he rode out, the horse moving steady and strong now, the limp finally gone. Naira stood on the porch, watching until he vanished over the ridge. A quiet ache stirred inside her. Not fear this time, but the unfamiliar feeling of missing someone she knew would return. The day passed slow. She spent it tending the herbs, mending old hides, and cleaning the shelves. Every so often she found herself glancing at the door, listening for the sound of hoofbeats. The cabin felt different in his absence, not empty but waiting. By late afternoon, clouds gathered again, though this time they brought no storm. The wind came gentle, carrying warmth instead of grit. Naira stepped outside and saw Elias riding back, a bundle of lumber tied behind his saddle and a new blanket folded under his arm. He waved once. She smiled without meaning to. When he dismounted, she noticed a bruise on his jaw. What happened? He shrugged. A drunk at the saloon didn't like being told to watch his mouth. Her eyes narrowed. You fought. Only enough to stop him from finishing what he started. She wanted to scold him, but didn't. Instead, she said, next time, let it be. He gave a faint grin. Next time, I'll take you with me. They wouldn't dare then. Her laugh was short, unexpected. It was the first time she had laughed in years. They carried the lumber inside, working side by side again. By evening, the repairs were done, and a new stillness filled the cabin. Not the hollow kind of silence from before, but something steady, content. When supper was ready, they ate near the fire, their movements slow, unhurried. Outside, the sky burned with the last light of sunset, and the sound of the creek drifted through the open window. Elias leaned back in his chair. You ever think about leaving this place? He asked. Naira thought for a moment. I used to, she said. Now I think about what to plant next spring. He smiled. That's a better plan. And you? She asked. You still think about moving on? He looked into the fire, his voice low. No, I've had enough of running. The words settled between them with quiet certainty. Later that night, when the fire burned down to embers, Naira stood by the door, looking out over the dark horizon. Elias joined her. For a moment, they just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the faint shimmer of stars return. You could have left, she said softly. You had reason to. He shook his head. Maybe I came here looking for a place to stop pretending. Maybe this is it. She turned her face toward him, her eyes reflecting the dim firelight. Then stay, she said simply. He didn't answer right away. He just reached out, his hand finding hers. She didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like something long overdue. They stood that way for a while, saying nothing. The night air was cool, filled with the scent of wet earth and cedar. The sound of the creek rolled steady in the distance, like the heartbeat of the land itself. When she finally looked at him, she saw the weariness that had once defined him was gone. In its place was something quieter, peace maybe, the same peace she'd been searching for since the day her husband didn't come home. Tomorrow, Elias said, his voice soft, we'll fix the corral. After that, maybe start building a new barn. She nodded. Then we'll need more hands. He smiled. We'll find them. Or we'll manage. Naira's eyes softened. We'll manage. The fire behind them flickered low, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the land stretched wide and endless, but for once, neither of them felt small beneath it. They stayed there until the stars blurred into the first light of morning, two silhouettes standing still at the edge of a new day, not haunted anymore, not waiting for anyone to return. When the sun finally broke over the ridge, its light spilled across the cabin, touching the walls, the tools, the small details of a life rebuilt. Naira tightened her hand around his and exhaled slowly. She didn't think about the past, or the pain, or the years lost to silence. She thought only of the warmth beside her and the simple truth that, after everything, they had both chosen to stay. The creek kept flowing, steady and alive. The desert wind moved gently through the open doorway. And inside that small, weathered cabin, two people who had once been ghosts began, quietly, to live again.